The Reserve Bank today released its annual report on the state finances, and some trends were very surprising. Firstly, contrary to belief, transfer of revenues from the centre to the states did not increase after the 14th Finance Commission. On the contrary, central transfers to states, including taxes and grants, fell from 6.6% of GDP in FY17 to about 6.3% in FY16. Latha has more interesting trends from the RBI report. Latha, point by point, what are the game-changing trends that have been notified?
Well, this was actually a shocker that after the 14th Finance Commission, the states got less of the central pool than they did earlier. Now, this is how it happened. We all know that the State Finance Commission increased the state's share of the central taxes from 32% to 42%. So obviously you would think more money will go, but what actually happened was when the centre transferred the money, it also transferred many schemes which were called centrally sponsored schemes to the states. So the grants that it gave to them for those schemes fell more than the share of taxes rose. So actually, while in FY15 the state's share was 6.6% of the GDP, in FY16, that is after the 14th Finance Commission got implemented, the state's share fell to 6.3% of the GDP. So as a percentage of GDP, it was a fall of 0.3% because grants fell very sharply. In fact, I can tell you that the shareable taxes went up from 2.9% of GDP to 3.4%, but grants fell from 3.7% to 2.9%. So it was a switching of numbers, and because of the steep fall in grants transferred, the states actually were slightly poorly off after the 14th Finance Commission. The other important trend that we got from a very rapid reading of the report is that the deficits of state governments rose very sharply in FY14 and FY15. FY14 was the slowdown problem. In FY15, the deficit continued because a substantial amount of central monies was transferred to state government. Now, that is actually very peculiar. FY15, you notice everything better for the states. Much more central money came in. As well, you saw a lot of expenditure on roads. Of course, even natural calamities took a large chunk. I would assume the Uttaranchal calamity. There also more expenditure on sports, education. FY15. FY16, everything falls rapidly because the screws were turned and they were told fiscal deficit has to come down. So fiscal deficit of states rises from 2% in FY13 to 2.2% in FY14 to 2.9% in FY15, but it drops to 2.6% in FY16. Now, because the screws were turned, the axe actually has fallen on development expenditure, and the numbers will run for you. The development expenditure has taken quite a big beating in FY16, but revenue expenditure has not taken a beating, which is sad. It appears like the central schemes were transferred. Because they were transferred, all the administrative expenses continued. But the development expenses, like probably roads and education, took a beating in FY16. So fiscal consolidation has come at a price for development. Well, let's get a little more erudition and perspective on these numbers. Dr. Pranab Sen, the former Chief Statistician of India and also Chairman Statistics Commission, has joined us first. Dr. Sen, is this a major revelation that after the 14th Finance Commission's largesse, states are poorer off?
No, it's not a revelation at all.
Okay.
This is something that I think was being talked about, that what you are doing in effect was you are reducing the discretionary funds available to the central ministries. Because you're transferring them to states through the Finance Commission transfers.
Okay.
So now within the central ministries, clearly what seems to have happened is that there's been much greater protection of the funds that were essentially central sector schemes. And the cut has fallen predominantly on the centrally sponsored schemes.
Okay.
Okay, it had been a stated intent, and the government, in fact, even in the budget had said that the states would have to bear a larger share because of the resources. But the larger share has apparently been interpreted to mean that the
Larger
state-
share of the responsibility.
Yeah. No, that's fine. I mean, they should bear larger share of the responsibility, but I think it's more than proportionate.
Okay. Well, the other trend that came, that appears to be coming is that FY15 has seen a remarkable rise in all kinds of expenses, revenue and capital in the states. But FY16, they've all fallen rather badly. Well, they've come back to FY14 levels in some cases even lower. But largely, can you explain this, sir? FY15, you see a fairly decent rise in all kinds of capex, and even the central transfer is much higher in FY15. FY16, everything has deteriorated, and the axe has fallen maximum on capital expenses, developmental expenses.
Well, as far as the states are concerned, they face a hard budget constraint. I mean, it's the center which determines the borrowing limits of each state, and the states have to adjust within it. Now, what that means in effect is that when the state is, any state is actually making its computations as to what it can and cannot spend, a lot of it depends not just upon what it intends to spend upon, but upon the amount of liquidity that it has. Because that's what the borrowing limit is doing.
Yes.
So that if you have central government payments getting delayed, the states are having to actually shell that out from within their borrowing limits. Okay? Now, this can be a yo-yo. I mean, it can go from 1 year excess, the other year you go on to the deficit side. And that's an unstable way of doing things.
Well, the other trend was that actually capital expenditure has remained quite muted at about 3% of GDP. Revenue expenditure has been around 14% of GDP and actually rose to almost 16% in FY15. So revenue expenditure as a percentage of state GDP has been high and rising, and capital expenditure as a percentage of GDP has been low and largely flat, very, very minor increases in the budgeted estimate. And look at the difference, just 3% of GDP, sir.
Yeah, well, this you should have expected. For most of the schemes that the states run, these are essentially revenue expenditure oriented. This is really all the social sector things are in the states. Now, what was happening earlier is that the center would have a CSS, it would be transferring grants to states, and the states would use those grants for capital expenditure.
Okay, so as grants fell, capital expenditure fell, you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay.
So now what has happened is, since it's going essentially in terms of the revenue deficit grant basis, you're focusing mainly upon the revenue side.
Okay.
Right? So we have to remember that in terms of the constitutional provision for the expenditure responsibilities between the center and the states have a much higher component of revenue expenditure.
Okay.
It's in the nature of the constitutional
right.
obligations.
Yeah, Dr. Sen, please do stay on. The other unsavory point that came from the finances report is that pensions as a percent of state GDP has really shot up. In the early 90s, it was as low as 0.7% of the GDP. And now it stands at almost 1.7%. And every year it has been rising. Currently, FY16, the last number is almost 1.7% of state GDP is accounted for by pensions. So that again is a revenue expense that keeps on increasing. Do stay on, Dr. Sen. Jai Shankar, the chief India economist at Religare, and Aditi, the chief economist at ICRA, the senior economist at ICRA, is also with us. Well, first thoughts, Jai Shankar. First, that actually the states got less money from the 14th Finance Commission. And secondly, that the axe is falling on development expenditure as they become fiscally disciplined.
Well, I think, Latha, that has been the concern of late of the desirability, if you like, of greater transfers from the states as per the 14th Finance Commission, because when you are transferring those discretionary spend to the states and leaving it to the states. And there are two issues there. Obviously, the states have a limited capacity themselves in terms of utilizing the additional fund which is flowing in from the center to the state in terms of using it for developmental use and capital formation. So that's one issue. But beyond that, it would be very logical, or not logical, but it would be very easy to build a case that the states are lured into, say, increasing the revenue part of the expenditure because of obviously political economic reasons. And we have seen that in the past as well. So, for example, Telangana gave a 43% pay hike to all its government staff.
Okay.
So, to put it into perspective, this can be a new chapter, if you like, in the fiscal federalism that we talk about. Whether it is how much of it is desirable when you transfer more and more resources to the states and leave it to them to decide on how to use that money.
Okay. Well, another interesting part that came from the discussion or from the papers is that the states did not waste the crisis. I mean, if we thought that the central finances went for a toss in the year of the crisis, the Lehman crisis, the states did not waste it either. The deficit increased very sharply. Of course, the expenses were on education, health, roads and bridges and energy. But you see an equally sharp decline, especially in energy expenditure in the post-crisis period, which I think is what has led to this very unhappy problem with state discoms. So again, that's an added point which comes from the report. This report ends with FY16. It doesn't take into account the FY17 numbers, but it appears that fiscal deficit of states is obviously going to increase in FY17 because of the Uday bonds. And that will flow into FY18 as well, because part of the expenditure comes in the following year, and also their interest expenses rise in FY18. They pay for more bonds. Aditi, any comments, quick comments on the numbers we just read out?
Latha, 2015-16 was a very interesting year. We had these big changes that came in from the 14th Finance Commission right before most states had to present their budget. So I'd first like to just point this fact out, that the budgets for 15-16 were perhaps not very well representative of what the fiscal trends were really in the year to come. The states really didn't have time to account for some of these changes, more of the anti-devolution versus the tied grants, and then again the change in norms for a lot of CSS schemes, which was subsequently announced around November by the Niti Aayog subcommittee of chief ministers on CSS schemes. So I think we do need to keep that in mind. We have actually looked at the revised estimates for 15-16 for some systematically important states that we do tend to look at very closely every year. So I'd just like to point out some of the, let me say, relatively more updated trends that we've gotten from the revised estimates. One, as far as the tax revenues of the states themselves were concerned, they have been lower than what was budgeted at the beginning of the year, and that's really because of lower VAT collections on fuels. And that was to be expected given the kind of decline that we saw most of the year on petrol, diesel and ATF. Secondly, if we look at, where did this additional devolution of untied tax money go, once the states realize how much money was actually going to flow in, do the revised estimates paint a different picture as compared to the budget estimates for capital expenditure? Now, I have to say that only very few states have actually shown higher allocation for capital expenditure in their revised estimates as compared to the budget estimates, and even there the amount is actually quite limited. So, with the planning that the states would have had, the time that they had through the year, it's not as if they've been able to majorly increase their capital spending over what they had already budgeted. Another way of looking at it is with the incremental funds that came in during the year, how much of it went towards capex versus revex. So the increment in 15-16 over 14-15. There again, it's not as if there's an overarching bent that all the untied money that came in really went into capital expenditure. Lastly, when we look at, as Dr. Sen pointed out, the states do have a hard fiscal deficit constraint. But on the revenue deficit versus revenue surplus side, I think that is something which is very important to look at as well. And the trends are really unchanged. So the states that we look at, a lot of them had revenue deficits in 14-15, and they've continued to show revenue deficits in 15-16 as well. So there isn't really this trend that higher devolution has helped the states to transition to revenue surpluses.
No. Okay. Yeah, on the contrary, now for other reasons, the deficit would increase primarily because of the Uday bonds. And just one more point I want to make before I wind up this conversation. The state level enterprises are quite a dismal picture. There are about 849 enterprises with 18 lakh employees. 30% of them are loss-making. So there again is some money which states can save if they wind down in some fashion or rationalize the kind of expenses and losses they are incurring state level at the state level enterprises. Of course, a large part of it would be contributed by the discoms who are hopefully returning to some kind of financial health. Well, we have to wind up on this note and leave you gentlemen, to read the actual report which will be with you. It's not a very pretty picture. It shows that state deficit has come down, but it has come down at a price. There are other minutiae that the better off states are actually doing a better job both in fiscal deficit and in developmental expenditure. And the very poor states are actually also catching up. And there is a better expenses that is given to education, roads, health and energy. Yeah. It is the middle states, the B category states, which are neither here nor there and are showing a fairly poor performance.
All right, Latha, thanks for putting that into perspective.